And it's just awesome to be here. I was going to be here last winter, but when we decided it needed to be online, I'm like, no, I want to be in person. I've done enough Zoom talks, and I guess I'm sort of half on Zoom and half here, but happy to have you interrupt me if questions come up. And I guess Zoom folks, if questions come up, somebody will need to alert me. I have no idea who, what, where, and how that's all working. I want to start out with just this gorgeous image of a barn swallow and just say that if you're in the Northern Hemisphere in April, all the way through September and actually getting close to October, and you look up, you will often encounter this beautiful bird. And if you are in the Southern Hemisphere, during the months of October through March, you will also see this bird. And in fact, the barn swallows have one of the broadest distributions of certainly all birds and rivals many widely distributed vertebrates, including ourselves. So in this map here in brown, we see the breeding distribution. And many of these populations make these long distance migratory movements to these locations in blue. And there's even some cool spots on the map colored in purple where the birds just stay in place year round. And so what I want to talk about tonight is this bird, of course. It is what I've been studying for 26 years. And I want to talk about its relationship to our own species. I'm going to tell you a bit about the science that we've been doing as we've journeyed across the world to study this bird. And I also want to talk about what and how we're doing things differently now that we know that this bird is precipitously declining throughout its range. And so it's a bit of a personal story. This is me holding a nestling. You can't see it, but it's there. And I've been studying barn swallows since 1998, all over. I'll tell you a little bit about some of our travels. But it's also a story of the transformation of me, a total researcher, into doing some of the work that we do now related to bird conservation and science communication. So quite a big leap from my training, but absolutely something that I'm incredibly passionate about and want to introduce you to. Before I get started in telling you a lot of the stories about the science that we do, I just want to put up some faces. You'll see them throughout the talk. I've had the immense pleasure of working with a lot of graduate students, some of whom you've seen at Colorado Horse Rescue. There's a few folks here from one of our field sites. And this is just a collage of the students who have gotten master's degrees or PhDs or have done postdocs, but there's hundreds and hundreds of undergrads who have helped to collect all these data. So just a huge acknowledgement that this is a massive team enterprise. And mentorship is one of the best parts of my job. Also need to give a massive shout out to my husband here in the bike helmet, and my son Noah and my son Aaron. They're a little bit older now, but I just love this photo. This photo was sent to me while I was traveling in China just to reassure me everyone's doing fine, everyone's alive, or even biking. Without the support of Sam, there's just no way that we could have done half or a quarter of any of the travels and work and all the strange hours that I keep to do it. So I started studying barn swallows in 1998. I was a starting graduate student in Ithaca, New York. And I had chosen this species because I didn't know where I was going to go do my graduate studies. And I wanted to be really practical in terms of choosing a study system. And I didn't know, would I be on the East Coast? Would I be on the West Coast? Could I get into, the school that I wanted to get into in upstate New York? So I chose the barn swallow because they're everywhere. They're easy to study and they're literally everywhere. And I was excited to choose a system also where just a ton of information had already been collected and gathered, primarily by a group of European researchers who co-authored this paper. And one of the things that I was really interested in was how is it that individuals choose one another as mates. Those decisions have massive, massive consequences for the evolutionary trajectory of populations. And I was excited that a lot of the details had been worked out, right? So if you look at a barn swallow or you've seen a barn swallow in flight, you know they have those forked tail streamers. And decades of work had been done in Europe to demonstrate that the longer a male's tail streamer is, the more offspring he sires, the less parasites he has, the better mate he is, suggesting that the length of tail streamers is some indicator of health, quality, parental behavior, all kinds of cool things. And I thought, great, I don't have to collect all those details. They've already been worked out. So I started going to a lot of different barns in upstate New York and setting up my studies and catching hundreds of birds and measuring their tail streamers and measuring reproductive behaviors. And after 2 years of looking for a pattern between tail streamer length and reproductive success that had been found and demonstrated over and over again in the European populations, I was coming up empty. And my advisor was like, are you measuring things the right way? Are you, how are you actually doing this? How could you be wrong? And I started noticing that, if you take a look at European barn swallows, they're pretty pale and they have really long tail streamers. But the birds that I was measuring in upstate New York were pretty dark in color, certainly compared to the birds in Europe. And their tail streamers were on average a lot shorter. I started paying attention to coloration, and lo and behold, found that it's the darker males that are doing better, have fewer parasites, are better parents. And so started to really think about this system from a larger scale perspective, and sort of put together this comparative study of barn swallows, which are comprised of 6 different subspecies, and also have representatively different phenotypes or morphologies with respect to the extent of coloration. Some are really dark, and also with respect to the elongation of those tail streamers. So what I thought was a mistake in my first 2 years of grad student has now become a 26-year-long endeavor of trying to understand why it is that these populations look so different from one another and what that can tell us about evolution, ecology, and behavior. These populations are really, really interesting from an evolutionary perspective because they're subspecies. So they're not full species yet. They're actually really closely related populations. And I'll give you a sense for the age in just a moment that we've confirmed through genomic testing. But this is a very recently radiated group, which means these populations are incredibly closely related to one another, yet they occupy similar habitats throughout this massive distribution. They build their mud cup nests almost exclusively on human constructed structures. They are aerial insectivores, so they are opportunistic as to what they'll eat, but it has to be a flying insect. And yet there's all this interesting variation in how they look, as well as their behavior with respect to migration. So these populations along the Nile River Valley and in Israel don't migrate, and then all the other populations sort of in continental Europe, Asia, and North America make these really long distance seasonal migratory movements. So we first started to we wanted to assemble our evolutionary understanding of these relationships. It's one thing to look in a field guide and say, oh, okay, they look kind of similar. They've been designated as subspecies, but you have to actually do some of the genetic work to figure out the evolutionary relationships or sort of the family tree of swallows. And part of this work was led by a recent PhD student, Dr. Javon Carter. And for any comparative study, you want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples versus apples to oranges, right? So if we found that populations in the Middle East were completely different evolutionarily and had evolved at a very different time from populations in North America, it would be hard to start studying and comparing these populations, because they're so different. However, what we did find when we look at the family tree of these 6 subspecies is that they're really closely related. The relationships are not very well resolved, and that they are more closely related to one another than they are to any other members of the genus in which they reside. So for an evolutionary biologist wanting to do comparative study, that's a key ingredient that you need to check to make sure that you are comparing things that are most closely related to one another. So we confirmed that. And we confirmed that all the subspecies are in fact barn swallows. Their evolutionary history is very messy, which is cool. It means it's still untangling. Things are still evolving apart from one another or not. And I think that one of the most interesting findings is that the evolutionary relationships shown here do not at all predict what these birds look like. So for example, I knew I'd do this at least once. For example, in one half of this evolutionary branch, you have really dark individuals with respect to plumage coloration, and you also have really light individuals. So it's not as if the most closely related populations are all dark or all light. The other thing that we wanted to confirm is, okay, so that phylogenetic hypothesis or the family tree of barn swallows gives us a sense for their relationships, but how old are these populations? When did they start colonizing the Northern Hemisphere? We've only ever seen them on human constructed structures. Has anyone seen them in a natural habitat, like a cliff overhanging or something that is not human constructed? I've looked everywhere, I've never seen it. So I always ask because, so we wanted to figure out, okay, did they leave the Middle East at the same time that humans did? And through a lot of genomic testing and genomic analyses, we learned that these populations left the Nile River Valley towards the end of the Holocene, when humans were just starting to move into the Northern Hemisphere and actually start constructing stable territories or farmsteads. And so the Holocene, just to give you a date, is about 11,000 years after the last glacial period. And it's in this epoch that we see the development of major human civilizations spread throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And it's during this period also that we see this significant transition towards urbanized living in human populations. So that's Chris's work. And we wanted to kind of look side by side at all kinds of human genome projects and human archaeological projects and the origins of agriculture to better understand whether the dates corresponded to one another. And if you start sort of eyeballing what you see here, right around the Fertile Crescent, which is 11,000 years before present, again, right at the start of the Holocene, it doesn't take much to imagine that the patterns of dispersal are very much like patterns of dispersal in human populations, as well as patterns of settlement. And this is a hypothesis that we're testing more closely right now by looking at maps and better understanding the development history, the origin of ages of cities, and all kinds of other things to start confirming the concomitance of the state. The other fun thing is to sort of think about, well, what did these first human structures or urbanized centers look like? This is a really famous research project that's in Turkey. And it's one of the very first archaeological pieces of evidence of this transition from settled villages to more urbanized centers. And it dates back to about 9,000 years, a bit after that period of leaving the Fertile Crescent, 2,000 years before. And based on the remains there and the dating of those remains, it appeared that this civilization was very vibrant and active for about 2,000 years. And there are all sorts of 3D renderings and drawings of what it would look like inside these structures. And I just want to point your attention to these rafters here. Oh, this pointer is not working. Doesn't take much, at least for me, to imagine that the places where barn swallows currently build their nests are very similar to the interior structures of some of the oldest human civilizations that have been preserved and studied. And again, I have never seen, nor have I chatted with anyone who's ever seen a barn swallow building a nest outside of a human constructed environment, although apparently they did build towards the entrances of caves or maybe a cliff overhanging. But barn swallows are nearly exclusively human commensals at this point. That is, they live on our human built structures. And barn swallows have been with us a long time. So if you just sort of take a tour through art history and you look at evidence from the ancient Egypt hieroglyphs, the barn swallows were there. We even talked to a mummiologist who studied the preservation of animals along with humans during burials, and barn swallows were in fact mummied and buried alongside certain individuals many years ago in ancient Egypt. They are certainly very present during the Bronze Age. Here's just one example of a painted barn swallow and depicted on Bronze Age pottery. We see them in wall paintings dating back to about 2,800 years ago from ancient Greece. They are all over ancient literature where there are tales abound about human relationships and all sorts of legends about our relationships with barn swallows, which we encountered firsthand as we were traveling around the world. So for example, if you want to go catch a barn swallow in Russia, you have to convince the owner that if you capture the bird that's breeding on its dasha, that it actually won't come back and burn the house down. Because the legend is, if you, disturb them, that they're gonna get back at you. Barn swallows are portrayed across postage stamps all over the world. They are the most famous bird when you think about representation of birds on postage stamps. They are the most popular tattoo. Anyone in here have a barn swallow tattoo? Start looking for them. They're everywhere. And during the pandemic, when we couldn't do field work, a very talented honors thesis student, Vani Fachon, built this beautiful website where she curated stories of human relationships with barn swallows by contacting artists all over the world and archaeologists and also scientists. So there's the website, and it's just this absolutely gorgeous composition of how do you say barn swallow in like 15 different languages, and what are the cultural stories and significance of barn swallows to humans all around the world. So to the science, how in the world do we study barn swallows all around the world? Well, we find barns. We talk to a lot of people, like the good folks at the Colorado Horse Rescue. We tell them that we need to be catching birds at like 2 a.m. or 2:30 a.m. Our field day starts quite early. As I was telling my dinner companions, these birds are like the first birds up. We temporarily catch them as they're waking up and leaving their nests in these fine mesh nylon nests. And they're very docile in hand. We can take a bunch of measures. We will give them a Fish and Wildlife Service tag, and we will give them some other unique markers so that with a pair of binoculars, we can figure out who's at which nest. So we figure out who the social pair is at a nest, and then we eavesdrop on their reproductive activities. How well of a parent is the male? How great is the mom at incubating? How much time does she spend off the nest? Who is she interacting with when she's off the nest? We then will band the nestlings when they're 10 days old, and we'll take a blood sample from those nestlings because it's a good chance that half of them are not sired by the dad that's taking care of them. In fact, extra pair mating is a big, big part of the reproductive behavior of these birds and humans, even though people don't want to acknowledge this. And so we need to do some genetic forensics work to figure out who the other dads are. And sorting out all of these reproductive decisions gives us a sense for how population genetic structure is built and maintained, and how maybe across space it diverges. So we've measured all of these traits all over the various 6 subspecies. And just to give you a sense for how they vary on this bottom graph here, just showing you the typical male from 6 different subspecies and variation in their tail streamer length, variation in their wing length, and then variation in that wash of color on their ventral surface. So what our naked eyes tell us from field guides actually can be measured. And again, if you want to establish a comparative study, you actually want to have some quantitative differences in order to be able to, rather than just eyeball differences, in order to be able to measure them. One of my favorite features of the system, well, there's 1,000 favorite features of the system, is that we can manipulate these traits. So we can make a male's plumage darker, and we can use a non-toxic colorant that makes it darker within the range of natural variation. So we're not making this individual like a color or a shade of red that's, you know, way outside the norm. We can also shorten or elongate tail streamers. So we can bring the phenotypes or the morphologies of different subspecies into one location to start doing experiments about why is it that males in Israel have really long tail streamers and are really dark in color, whereas males in Asia are very small and pale and have very short streamers. How is all this variation being maintained? And it's always humbling to show decades of experimental work in one slide, but here it is. What we found by doing the same exact type of experiment in 3 different populations is that, in fact, their appearance relative to one another seems to be associated with different mate choice decisions made by females. So a typical US population is relatively dark with relatively short tail streamers when you compare it to the others. And in fact, females tend to prefer males with shorter tail streamers and darker color. The opposite is true in Central Europe, where males tend to be really pale in color and have really long tail streamers. And in Israel, you got to have it all to be successful. And so their males are really dark with long streamers, and our experimental evidence also corroborates that. So part of the puzzle for why these populations look different is that there's different mate selection decisions going on. There's a whole separate set of studies that are focused on why would there be different mate selection decisions? Why would females want males with shorter streamers or darker color? A brilliant PhD student, now her own professor running a lab, measured all the parasites in these different populations, which also seem to correspond with some of the mate selection differences. So mysteries abound. We also wanted to just take a step back. You know, we'd done these experiments to confirm, okay, these cartoons seem to be, you know, and the differential morphologies, color and streamers seem to be related to something about female choice. But what else could be going on? And one of the sweet spots for an evolutionary biologist is when populations collide into one another and distributions that were previously sort of isolated from one another come back into secondary contact. And when we were looking at the map, we were just literally looking at a field guide saying, where do we need to figure out if these populations are hybridizing? And so we circled these places on the map and we went to all of them, which might seem absolutely insane. But luckily, it was just one cool discovery after the other with respect to barn swallow evolutionary biology. So as I was telling my dinner companions, a team of students got off the plane in Moscow, hopped on the Trans-Siberian Railway, got off every now and again, and measured barn swallows all across Russia, Siberia, into the Sea of Japan. We did another transect through Mongolia, and then several different transects in China, sampling also along the Nile River Valley, and then in Israel. And what that revealed is, indeed, there are subspecies populations that collide into one another. And these are just flagged in yellow here. And what's cool about that is, well, we could take all the samples that we collected home and we could develop a whole bunch of genomic resources, and we could start to unravel what is happening when these populations that were previously isolated are now coming into contact. From the perspective of a speciation biologist, what you want to know is, if these populations encounter one another, do they or do they not choose one another as mates? If they do not, then we would consider them to be reproductively isolated. If they do, then there's all sorts of interesting questions to study. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the location of these hybrid zones, 3 of them, tended to coincide in the same position in Eurasia, which also seemed really interesting to us. Okay, so this is what a hybrid zone tends to look like. So if you're just west of Lake Baikal and you are banding barn swallows, you might get a really, really dark male, or you might get a really pale male. And we collected a small blood sample from all of these birds, developed genomic resources to better understand what subspecies are they. If they're really dark, are they Guturalis, transitiva? What are we looking at here? As we traveled across space, we were able to make inferences about the extent to which populations are evolutionarily separate or are literally just sort of the same population with a lot of variation in it. And so a really nifty method that evolutionary biologists use are called these geographic clines. And a geographic cline is a measure. I'm sorry this doesn't work here, but I'm looking at this x-axis here. It's a transect across space, where you're basically just stopping and sampling the genetics of a population, as well as the morphology of a population. And you're just basically asking, where these populations overlap, is there this steep jump so that there's no overlap in their genomes or their morphology? Or is there a gradual one? Or is there just a straight line? And based on the results, you could infer that these populations are overlapping, but they're not interbreeding at all. They're literally separate. They're coexisting as separate species. In this case, you would say that they're hybridizing. They're on top of each other spatially, and they're also interbreeding. And in this case here, they're just basically one big population with all sorts of variable phenotypes. So we conducted these analyses across all of these transects, and I don't need you to worry about the details too much, but in all of the transects that were associated with the Tibetan Plateau and above, what we found is that these genetic clines here, shown in purple, ancestry, were very coincident with a measure of migratory behavior. And when you see these things that are lining up, it gives you a sense for, okay, so there's a transition in ancestry. You have one subspecies here, one subspecies here, and they're hybridizing. And at the ends of those distributions, you have birds that are migrating potentially to different locations. When we looked at all of these eastern transects, we found these populations were just completely intermixing. No signal at all of any kind of breakpoint in genetic ancestry. or migratory behavior. And we started to really start wondering about these migratory differences and whether or not they were part and parcel of how these populations were becoming differentiated. So we went back to one of the transects along the Yellow River Valley in the Gansu province of China. I know one of you in the room has been there. Anyone else been to the Gansu province of China? It's pretty remote and it's pretty amazing. And we put, we basically followed, our transect followed one of the old Western Silk Road routes. And we started in actually Lanzhou, traveled through Zhangye to all the way to Dunhuang. And as we did travel across this transect, just to give you a sense for what it looks like, this is Zhangye, which is sort of the center of the hybrid zone. You can see that it's a river valley that is flanked by pretty high, arid, sort of desert-like habitats. It really is an oasis of sorts. And if you zoom in on Google Earth, you see that there are all these little villages, and they are practically identical. If you zoom in a bit more on one of these villages, you can see that they're multi-generational homes and there's a garden inside and they're surrounded by ag land. And then if you zoom in, you see that most of the doors of these homes have a barn swallow. And the barn swallows are absolutely welcomed. They are considered good luck. The owners are very proud to have a barn swallow breeding there. They will decorate around the nest in order to entice the barn swallows there, and they're very much cherished. So we were able to go into these small villages and just quickly catch the birds and put these tags on them. It took a bit of negotiating. I do not speak the local dialect of Mandarin, but luckily my grad student Lu Yu does. And it's often several hours and cups of tea before an owner is willing to have us just temporarily catch a bird. We have a bird in hand, maybe 10 minutes. We get our samples and we let it go. So here we are on our transect, and we're putting these little light level sensors on the back of these birds, very much like we would have a backpack on. They're less than half a gram. They're archival. What that means is we have to recover these tags in order to get the data back from them. So we traveled this transect. We enticed as many farmers as we could to be able to catch their birds, put on these light level sensors, and we're able to reconstruct the migratory behavior of these birds. And just to step back, one of the things that we were curious about is if you are more red-like in ancestry, that is, you're more Hyrunda rustica, and you're more, your distribution is more Europe, do you have a different migratory route than if you're more blue-like or Guturalis or Asian distributed? And our working hypothesis is that the reason these populations are becoming separate or evolving, differentiating, is that they have really different migratory behaviors. So the tracks from the red birds demonstrate that these populations are going way over the Taklamakan Desert, and they are coming down all the way into East Central Africa. And to our great surprise, the birds that are more Guturalis-like, even though these populations are literally breeding in the same small village, are taking an incredibly different route, ending up in Sri Lanka or Southern Asia. And the cool thing about these differences is it means that these birds coming all the way back from Southern Asia are coming back about a month earlier than these populations. So even though they're breeding in the same villages, by the time these guys get back, everyone has already been back and breeding for about a month. So even though they're side by side, their breeding schedules are completely different. And from an evolutionary perspective, if they're not breeding, they're eventually going to be forming their own independent evolutionary trajectory. So we've been studying barn swallows all over the world. I've just given you a teeny tiny slice of some of the work that we've been doing to better understand how and why populations look different, how we understand what's happening in terms of diversification for all of these populations as a whole. But it's also really glaring when you're visiting these very remote villages around the world, where you're studying barn swallows like under the eaves of these little roofs all over or in the hallways, that these civilizations or these small villages are being torn down, and the residents are being asked or forced to move into more modern lodging. So in many of the locations that we sample in, yes, in China, but other parts of the world, the farmers or the landowners were, sure, you can band our bird, but we're all packing up and moving, and it's likely that we'll be living there next year. So massive habitat shifts. And you all being associated with the Audubon Society know that, you know, a decline in the barn swallow is not surprising, because there's just this massive decline in birds, you know, all over the world, right? We're just seeing this massive precipitous decline since the 70s. This is a paper that came out in 2019. How many of you know of this paper? I'm just curious. Is this 3 billion birds gone? Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think it's hard not to be tuned in. And aerial insectivores are very, very hard hit for a variety of reasons: habitat change, pesticides, all these things affecting the diet that they subsist on. I mean, you name it. It's not one thing. If it were one thing, maybe we could fix it, but it's not. In Canada, just north of us, there's now designations that barn swallows are considered threatened, which is, if you consider, this is one of the most widespread, most common bird on our planet, right? We have this amazing rich history of living side by side with these species, right? Tattoos and postage stamps and artifacts and art. And yet here we are seeing this massive decline. And when I talk to my colleagues in Canada, their projects have now shifted to, can we build artificial barns, right? So if old wooden dairy farms are, you know, no longer a thing, can we build habitats to help entice them? Yeah, it's absolutely wild how much is changing so quickly. So then the question becomes, what's going to happen to this beautiful story of coexistence that we've shared since our populations left the Nile River Valley in the Holocene at the Neolithic? And during the pandemic, I mean, it just felt like everything was, you know, I don't need to say, but, you know, the state of the world is a little hard if you look at it, right? So pandemic, war, climate change, human migrations because of climate change are just, you know, massive, unprecedented. And then on top of that, I have high school age kids who are afraid to go to school, and, you know, in the background of all of this, there's just mass extinction. So it's hard, right? And not being able to be in the parts of the world doing the work that we had grant funding for meant that our research program came to basically a grinding halt. For about 3 years. We had to get special permission even to work locally here in Boulder County, and many of our landowners, just for great reasons, just didn't want us around, right? Remember those days before the vaccines and all of that. So so what do? I guess you start thinking about the world as a whole and looking at your kids and your students, and you know, deciding to work with professors in theater and dance who make bird puppets. Let me tell you about this story. So the story starts with this problem that we have as scientists. We are really terrible communicators, right? So a lot of the reason I think that people don't believe in climate change or evolution is as much a translation problem and a communication problem as it is become a political problem. And so when we think about how we're getting our information or misinformation, you know, it's just easy to see how this snowballs. So misinformation, social media, whether there's fact checking or not. Depending on where you get your news, you can get, the same thing that's coming through the AP and Reuters, that's translated in wildly different ways, left or right. It's hard to know who is a trusted messenger and what to believe in. But understanding science has massive implications for how we vote and how we purchase and consume and buy, and a lot of decisions that we make on the day-to-day. And so, even just recently, like all of the polarization around vaccines, from a scientific perspective, should not be controversial. Evolution should not be controversial. Climate change, again, should not be controversial. And yet, there's just massive now a divergence and polarization, often tracking political party, when we think about all of these issues, whether it's to vaccinate or not, whether it's to teach evolution, whether it's whether females have the right to choose how to deal with their own reproductive biology, and much more. And so the acceptance of mainstream science is at an historic all-time low, right? It's just, there's lots and lots of data that suggests that people don't trust science. There's this massive mistrust issue, and sociologists and others who are tracking these data suggest that scientists are just like, well, if I gave you another graph, or I gave you another data point, or I gave you another this, then you would get it and you would vote and you would get your vaccine and we'd be done with all this. But that's just not true, because it depends on who's giving you the information or how the information's given. And so we know that providing the facts doesn't work. And we really thought during this pandemic period, I also teach a class on science communication, like, well, what does work, right? What does work? If it seems so obvious to us to get vaccinated, why is it that so many people won't get vaccinated? Just a really interesting question. And this kind of marked this transition of like, okay, I can't study my birds for the summer. I'm going to partner up with a bunch of amazing education and environmental communications and environmental design and theater folks to just see what we could do to deal with part of the science communication problem with as creative way that we could consider. And so this is the birth of our side-by-side program. The side-by-side piece is humans living side-by-side with non-human animals, the barn swallows being one of hundreds of things that live in or on our homes. Lots of credit to my amazing collaborators, grad students and undergrads, and then my colleague Beth Osnes and my colleague Chelsea Hackett. And our mission here was really born out of this need to consider who's left out of science. Why is it that science communication is so problematic? How might we do this differently? And so our mission is we support young women and those who embody or identify as women in co-authoring a way beyond the climate crisis through art-science connections, rich interspecies friendships, a sense of belonging in the natural world, and in STEM learning communities, and by sparking constructive hope. So we're like, let's just do everything. Why not, right? We're all just parked at home and let's just try these things out. And we decided, why do we focus on female identifying youth, right? Women in STEM still need role models. I would love to chat with you, and I could for hours, about what it was like being a graduate student who was the first female that was pregnant in my graduate student cohort at Cornell. There's still a lot of work to be done in the space of just increasing the presence of those who identify as females in the STEM space, unbelievably. And over dinner, boy, I was hearing about some of the other things that, okay, we've made some progress, but there's still a lot to be made. We focus on barn swallows because they're literally everywhere. So if you're trapped at home during a pandemic, it's not too much to actually go find one. They're really easy to find. And it gives you the sense of beauty in the everyday, right? They're common, at least they used to be. They're still common here. But they are declining and they need our help. We, as a STEM researcher and educator, just know that the data demonstrates when we have a diversity of problem solvers in a room, we get way better solutions. When we have people who have very non-traditional backgrounds or thinking creatively outside the box, we always end up in a better space than we have like-minded folks using the same tools. And the other thing that I never would have considered doing myself, because I am a scientist and an introvert, is this idea of embodying, right? So we had the youth choose a bird and then study the bird and then become the bird. And this is all due to my colleague in theater and dance, who literally studies how embodying something or becoming a part of nature can be this really powerful disruption and sort of change the way that you feel and view and behave, and also have a sense of belonging. So our first cohort, I did sort of a, I don't know, like a speed dating thing. What's your favorite color? What do you like to eat? Are you a night owl? Do you like water? And I paired each of these youth with a bird that represented their likes. They studied these birds and their natural habitats, and then they became these birds. And they became these birds in ways that they communicated to the public. So we did an exhibit at the library, we did a procession at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and we did these art hikes where people could hike along a trail, and these birds were placed in their natural habitat and would come out and tell people all about, like, you know, the various hummingbirds and magpies and all sorts of things. So it was just great fun. And we also collected some data. We were really curious, you know, our goal was not just to have a fun, great summer during the pandemic, but could we move the needle on a sense of belonging in STEM? Could we move the needle on whether or not these youth felt that they could identify as a scientist, that they felt an increased connection to nature, and maybe left after this program with a sense of hope for maybe the climate change crisis? And in every case, our data suggests that going through this program and embodying the bird that they were studying scientifically gave us some really interesting results and some hope. So the overall goal is that we want these youth going through these programs to become confident, to feel a sense of belonging and value as STEM researchers and communicators. And so that was great. And we've written articles, and we now have this amazing new National Science Foundation grant to be able to study bigger cohorts of students that become peer mentors for younger students and all kinds of fun things. And so this is me in 1998. I know I look exactly the same, in a barn, you know, studying barn swallows. And let me tell you, I never imagined that I would be here. But the pandemic does weird things to all of us, and it's been a great opportunity. Yeah, and I would say that we've taken a lot of lessons that have been personally important, but also important for the way that maybe I teach or mentor differently, which is, you know, natural history observation is key to understanding and observing our world. It's wild to me. When I was young, I could roam around the woods and just do whatever. And my dad gave me a pair of binoculars and voila. But kids don't do that so much anymore. I see a couple of young folks in the audience I'm super excited about. You all know as birders that observation is everything. You know, when you see a rare bird in a distribution that it's not supposed to be, it's just interesting that we don't have people watching. We're going to miss all this information about how quickly things are changing. Keep your eyes and mind open for the unexpected. For me, it was the puppets. I mean, wow, I never would have thought I would be making bird puppets with science students. You know, getting out of your comfort zone. This notion of disruption, I think, is very powerful. We need new solutions, right? We need to think outside of the box in terms of these climate change crises. So why not put on bird puppets and start imagining a different future? And I think one thing that we definitely learned is finding good partners for resiliency and hope in the face of so much bad news, and creating opportunities for others is very helpful. Hope is actually, it's an important element of being a human, as it turns out. So we have a massively active research lab, and we'll be traveling around the world studying barn swallows and collecting data to look at patterns of genomic divergence and understanding the evolutionary history and the evolutionary trajectory of these birds. And what we have found is that no two populations alike. You have a very similar genome that's being stretched in different ways as it's inhabited different parts of the world. So we're learning a lot about the process of new species formation through studying these birds. And they've also just been really inspiring for some of the science communication and belonging in STEM work that we've been doing. So I need to thank so many people, and thank you for having me. We've been luckily funded continuously by the National Science Foundation and many other organizations. So that is all I have for you. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
If somebody has a question, raise your hand.
Or just shared stories of, you know, your encounters.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have any evidence that we know that there's not maybe a pair bond, since they don't necessarily mate for life, but that maybe the pair comes back to the same location. I know I had a nest on my country place, and every summer that a pair would come and rebuild another nest. And I always thought they were the same pair, if it were. You think it was, or just
So the average lifespan of a barn swallow is about 2 breeding seasons, and we only see them, when they're building their nests and staying still. Most of the rest of the year, they're flying around and, doing what they do. I don't, if you had the same nest ongoing for 10 or even 50 years, which is not uncommon, it's obviously going to be the case that pair, is replaced. One thing that we have found is that it's often the case that the pair will come back together and set up shop at the same nest, or the pair mates will both be there, but they've chosen to do something different that season. So we've seen it all. The big question is, how did they find that one single nest like yours when they're the only ones that have been there and they're not the ones that are there now?
Yeah,
that's a big mystery.
Yeah.
Sandra, back to you. Do you have any questions from the Zoom group?
I don't see any yet. Zoomers, do you have questions? I have one actually about what would artificial, you said building barns to make housing for swallows. Are there other ideas about artificial housing, or I don't even know if it's artificial. It already was artificial. Barn swallows, I'm just thinking about that coexistence and where else would barn swallows find a happy spot?
We worked with actually a sculptor who built a life-size living sculpture at one of our breeding sites just to see if we could entice the barn swallows to nest there. They have their preferences, it has to be a wooden barn with beams that are just sort of this far apart and light environment. You saw that picture of the thing that looks like a barn, but it's on stilts. That's not going to crack it. There's been a lot of interest in having people preserve their old wooden barns, even though they're not inhabitable by humans. Leave them up if you can, because the barn swallows will still use them. They co-evolved with our structure, so it's really no surprise that as we change the way we build, they respond to that. The other thing that we've really thought about was how cool would it be to work with architects who are building structures that incorporated space for bats and barn swallows and wasps and mice and all the other things that live side by side with us.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I live in Lafayette by Wanaka Lake. Isn't this on?
Oh.
Hello, is it on? Okay. And all summer long, they have been spraying for mosquitoes, they're very concerned. And so I worry about the swallows because they don't have mosquitoes to eat. Is that
Yeah.
a concern or is that?
I know, I hate that. And so we, I mean, I don't know, West Nile barn swallows. I mean, I don't know. It's not exactly a selling argument. We put GPS tags on birds just to see, do they avoid those places where they're spraying? And the answer is they do. I mean, they might be avoiding it because there's simply just no insects to eat, or maybe they're sensing, other things in the environment. But if you put a GPS tag on a bird and you figure out exactly where it's foraging and moving, you can see the boundaries are pretty clear that they are just not going to those places where they're sprayed, at least to the best of our knowledge. We don't know the spray history of every single field, but we put these tags on barns that were adjacent to fields that we knew were being sprayed, different bodies of water and canals especially.
There's so many grasshoppers this year. I wish they would start eating grasshoppers.
Sandra, back to you. Any Zoom questions?
We do. Erin has a question here. Erin, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I hope I can articulate it. I was just curious about, so going back to the map of the subspecies like the rustica and the gutturalis, were they separate and then they began to overlap again because of following human settlement through the valley, or what was it that allowed them to kind of separate initially and then maybe come back together and overlap?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we've done recently is we looked at the dates of those places where those collisions are happening. And some of them are really recent. So from an evolutionary perspective, recent is like just a couple thousand years. And it sort of tracks, like we were moving along the one part of the Silk Road for a reason, right? We knew that humans had been there and that they'd been constructing settlements there. And the hybrid zones are about as old as when humans were settling in that part of the of Asia. We've also just anecdotally collected all sorts of stories of traveling across like the high steppe in Mongolia that's mostly just tall grassland, and then encountering, a road that has a bridge over a river. And you can see that the bridge was built in 1993. It's stamped on there, and the barn swallows are in there underneath the bridge. So they track us somehow to be able to find these suitable spots. And we're doing a very fine spatial scale and genomic scale analysis of looking at the dates of cities and ages of cities and different layers of like when were roads developed or when were bridges constructed, to really start piecing this apart more quantitatively. That's a great question.
That's really cool. Can I ask a follow-up, or is there time?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. So how fine of a resolution of your genomic differences how fine of like a time resolution can you get from the genomic differences between two populations of birds? Like, can you get it down to 1,000 years or 100 years, or what do you estimate it to be?
Absolutely. So when you are comparing genomes from one population to the next, you're really interested in parts of the genome that are becoming differentiated, and you're super interested in parts of the genome that are having fixed differences, right? A fixed difference, you would expect over thousands of years of evolutionary change or really strong selection. We see so few fixed differences when we compare barn swallows in parts of the world that we know don't encounter one another. So this is a really closely related young group of populations. And the parts of the genomes that are diverging are related to plumage coloration. And we can measure how selection is working on those parts of the genome that are associated with melanogenesis loci, the same things that give our skin and hair pigments, the same things that give barn swallow feather color, their color. It's the same sort of underlying genomic structure. And so the most divergent parts of the genome are associated with things that we can see and measure in terms of plumage coloration. But there are very, very few fixed differences. We're dealing with things that are just unwinding. And it's very similar to many of the human genome projects too, where studying human populations from all around the world just gives you a sense for all of these dispersal events. And you know, we've definitely complicated things with trains and railroads and all this other stuff. But barn swallows are incredibly closely related, as are human populations from different parts of the world.
Thank you.
I love the stuff about embodying and noticing nature and stuff. I was a little bit curious, when you're talking about the doubt of science, and then about teaching young people through art and activism, it seems sometimes from a sociological perspective or something that they're profitable entities that make a lot of money, like the oil companies or such, by doubting science. So even though they may use science to explore for oil, there's a book by Oreskes, Merchants of Doubt, about
Oh, it's a great book.
trying to, yeah. And so where am I going with this? Like that woman, Beth Osnes, she used to be, I think, part of Mothers Acting Up, working against some of the wars we have overseas. And at that point, with young kids, she was marching in the streets. And so I love the idea of dressing up and observing, but it seems like, well, I mean, the Women's March was something, it seems like you almost have to organize and boycott or do something more than, like, I feel great if I'm watching a bird or a dragonfly or something, and sometimes I think Jack Turner in his book Abstract Wild is right, and we shouldn't really measure things quite as much. We might be messing them up the way we seem to do with salmon and other fish, our fish hatcheries. Things just spread diseases instead of helping us learn things. But anyway, so instead of trying to criticize and encourage you, do you see some ways your mixture of art and science can lead to change in our society? Because
I do, actually. I do. And I think education plays a massive role in this enterprise. So the colleagues that I have are thinking very differently about how we teach people about science. You know, instead of having these youth, you know, think only scientifically about the birds they're studying, we invite them to just have these wild observations that, you know, aren't necessarily scripted. You're not given a lab book to fill in. And we're really inviting people to have confidence in what they're observing as being just important as some of the more prescriptive ways that we've taught people to observe the world. So for me, coming through my degrees, if I told my advisor, I want to study barn swallows because I just love them and I think they're great, well, I would have been kicked out of the program. That's an exaggeration, but there's no room for love or excitement or personal connection in most of the science world. People view it as it's something else and it's abstract and you are very quantitative and you measure it. And yet I think that people are very passionate about what they do, and that the more creative a scientist is, the better their work. So I think art has a lot to say as to how we train people to not only observe the natural world, as to how we train our students, and as to how we observe the natural world itself. So many of us in my generation were trained like, this is what you do. You count this, you do that. We're trying to get rid of a lot of that and outsourcing to our students. Okay, we have this question. How do we answer this question? We might land on something completely different. These youth have the most amazing ideas. I mean, we are learning so much from them. So our role is to stand back And just to say like, yeah, great, I'm a card carrying professor. I made it through the gauntlet of an Ivy League education, blah, blah, blah. I'm giving the room to you. I need to learn from you. And it's just, I see a lot of change in the way that my academic department is training and teaching students. And I see a lot of the ways that my own children are being trained. And I think very positive thoughts about that. And I know we're Boulder, and that's a very weird bubble. But if we can train a next set of STEM science communicators who have confidence, who come from a diversity of backgrounds, who think outside the box, I think that's great. So that's the way that we're working. I, as someone who's using federal funds to collect data, cannot be, I can't be marching in the streets with my students. My colleague Beth can, she's in theater and that's what she does. So we're a great team. But yeah, I think our science is so much better in our science lab. So even the students doing just the genomics part of what we do, or just the parasite or whatever, really high techy stuff, they've been super influenced, and we work very differently than we have historically. And I just love that.
Sandra, do you have any other questions from your Zoomers?
I don't see any others. Anybody got a question?
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I was just interested in the fact that there seems to be some kind of selection for plumage color. And so that presumably is correlated with something that is of value to the bird in terms of, so why would that be correlated like that? It's kind of a...
That's $1 million question. So the question is related to, you have all these populations of birds, some are light, some are dark. It's the same underlying genomic structure in terms of how those pigments are built, deposited in growing feathers and all of that. So then you get into the question, well, it's not, like the genomes aren't different. And yet when you take a fine scale perspective at the parts of the genome that are associated with color, they're really different. It's really cool. And we know that part of that is just related to mate choice, but we don't know why that is. I mean, we know that in some parts of the range, if you're really dark, you have fewer parasites. If you're really light, there's just no parasites around, so who cares if you're dark? But we know there's a lot more to it. And so the genomic perspective is such a great complement, because some of these populations were probably formed just by chance. Like you had some populations that had certain, genetic variants that made them dark that ended up in South Asia, versus some that were just light that ended up here. And selection does what it does. It's definitely working in different ways in different populations on the same parts of the genome. So that's super cool. But we don't know exactly why. I mean, I could give you a million stories as to what I think and what we're testing, but we don't know exactly why. And I like your Michigan sweatshirt.
There's a question here. I don't know if I need it. You mentioned that you started on an island off of Connecticut. And I did that myself when I was in high school too. So I'm just wondering which island.
It was Kokini Island off the coast of Connecticut. And it's sort of, we were having a chuckle over it at dinner, this is like the early 1990s, and they just gave me this really crappy rowboat with an outboard motor. And they're like, yeah, just go, just do it. I didn't know anything about tides. I didn't know anything. And they were like, yeah, just tell us what birds are out there and all the plants and all the this and all that. And I had to be rescued by the Coast Guard a couple of times, because I didn't understand if I, hitched the little boat they gave me, that it would be in the middle of the water a couple hours later. Oh, it was a great summer.
Yeah, I did similar field trips out to the islands, the gulls nesting and.
That's great.
Oh, this teacher took us all over the place.
That's great.
Loved it. And I think that was a great experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish someone had taken me. They're like, this boat's yours, go. Sure. Yeah.
Sandra, do you have anybody?
We do not have any more questions here. Thank you.
Curious about the birds in the Nile Valley. You mentioned they don't migrate.
They don't migrate, yeah.
Have you been able to assess reasons for that?
I'm sorry, what's the second part of the question?
We've been able to assess reasons why they don't migrate or don't need to.
Yeah, so this gets into sort of the evolutionary history of barn swallows. And if you look at the family tree of barn swallows, which I told you they're all just sort of jumbled up. But if you step outside that and you look at other members of the genus to which they belong, they're primarily non-migratory. So we think that migration evolved when these birds started inhabiting the northern hemisphere, rather than, you know, that sedentary behavior being something special. I think it was the norm. Yeah.
Yeah, I have something that I wanted to speak to a little bit. Lots of folks are concerned about the decline of kestrels, a bird that we're used to seeing a lot of. And we have a very exciting opportunity with Becca, with the Audubon Society. And Becca, would you speak to that?
Yeah, so Pat, are you here? I haven't met Pat. I don't know if Pat's online. Pat Billing and I have been chatting a lot about having a student in my lab start to do some formal studies of the kestrels around Boulder County and possibly beyond, in partnership with a fellow whose name I can't remember right now.
Scott Rashid.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry. It's been a long day. Who's been putting hundreds and hundreds of boxes up and monitoring them. The idea being that it would be nice to start quantifying some things like arrival times and reproductive activity and how and why it differs. And of course, love to have some genomic perspective sort of add into it just to better understand, you know, what's happening with the population. You know, that the genome is just this great sort of thing that you can unravel history with, right? We can't go back thousands of years in time with modern studies of just checking nest boxes, but we can start to look at the genome and all the variation in it to start getting a sense for, is this population sort of a relic? Is it declining? What parts of the genome are very variation poor or very variation rich? So I'm hopeful. Pat and I had chatted about a student that we might be able to hire for the spring. I don't think that's going to work out, but I hope we figure something out. I'd be really excited to take part in that.
Yeah, we're really excited that that project will happen. And Pat is not here tonight. Yeah, but we have time for one more question. Or is anybody here in the rumor? Any of you rumors? Okay.
I know, young people, please come talk to me after. We need young people who like birds. We can pay you.
This past weekend, we were at a bird banding event at Bar Lake State Park.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of our stomping grounds. But one of the, I don't know if he's a ranger, I'll call him a ranger. He mentioned that, you know, the wildfires in Canada this year may have had a large impact on migration for many species coming through Bar Lake. So just wondering if you had any thoughts about the, like, because you didn't speak too much about the North American migration, but, you know, through Canada down through the Americas, impact of wildfire.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert in that area, although, you know, the amazing thing about migration in birds is that some birds migrate during the day, and you can imagine that really smoky skies would be a hindrance, and some use stars to navigate, and you can imagine that that could also be a problem. And some just use the Earth's magnets, in which case maybe they're not really worried about smoke. And I don't know which species aren't making it to Bar Lake as they should. But I do know that smoke pollution is bad no matter how you look at it, and that it's increasing. at an unprecedented rate. So, you know, a lot of these things are just happening so quickly that it's just, I mean, adaptation is this amazing tool that we have in terms of, you know, adjusting a genome or a morphology to a particular environment. But when the environment changes so dramatically, populations have a really hard time keeping up. And that's for 1,000 reasons. That's why we're seeing so many declines, not only in birds, but in many other species. Yep.
Well, thank you, Becca, and we really appreciate your coming tonight.
Thank you for the invitation.